Okay, thank you, Michael. This is fascinating, I have to say, to listen to you people that actually did it and the politics and the details. I think we're going to talk about some of the impacts now. And one of the things that strikes me so far, coincides with my views, is there are these catalysts, things that occur because of these trade agreements, such as the Uruguay round. I remember coming back from Brussels in that disappointing period where you said, this is not going to work. And then to say just a few years later, the whole thing is signed. So it's a very important part of this. Maybe just a couple of other catalysts which occurred to me. Just this year is also the 20th anniversary of central bank autonomy, central bank independence in Mexico. Yeah. And I don't think it's completely a coincidence. I think it's basically this move towards rules-based policy, if you like, the way you think it is really pretty much the same thing. The other thing, you didn't get to this, Michael, at the bottom of your slide about sort of maybe things are slowing down because of 9/11.
I'm going to cover that.
Maybe come back to it later. But
this afternoon.
So I was in the government in 9/11, came back, and I know what you're talking about. But I think on the other side of it, we always say it could have been worse. I think without the structure of NAFTA, it could have been a lot worse. Yep. I could just see the fact that you had those interconnections that prevented it from getting worse. In any case, we're not going to talk about the impacts. You're going to start, Steve, and then go to Dan. Thanks.
If you guys could put up my PowerPoint and I could use the clicker to advance it.
Here.
So first, let me thank Michael Boskin for inviting me to participate in today's session. And I have to say that I'm particularly thrilled to do it, in part because it's a delight for me to see the people that made NAFTA possible, but also because, for me, Mexico is something of an adopted country. And I've been traveling to Mexico now for over 40 years, and to see the change that has occurred in Mexico in the last 20 is truly remarkable. And one of the points I'm going to make today is that the effects of NAFTA go well beyond free trade. In fact, NAFTA had several unanticipated consequences, some of which have already been hinted at by, for example, John, when he says, well, that Mexico, this is also the 20th anniversary of central bank independence. The point I'm going to make today is that NAFTA opened up a process in Mexico that resulted in Mexico's democratization. It wasn't the intention of Carlos Salinas to do that. He was trying, in fact, for the party to hold on, for the PRI to hold on, but it set in motion a process that, in fact, became politically very difficult to control, and that I'm going to show you today redounded to the benefit of Mexican society. One of the points I want to make, sort of central points I want to make, is that prior to the 1990s, Mexico wasn't just closed to foreign trade. Mexico was closed to competition, period, inside Mexico. The Mexican economy was basically, you can think of it from the 1890s all the way to the 1990s as one huge cartel. In the post-revolutionary period, that is the period after the 1920s, what you basically have is a coalition of organized labor, public employees, factory owners, and politicians to win elections for a single party, the PRI, and then protect the country against foreign trade by having extremely high tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, protect the manufacturers from competition through a whole range of cartel-like arrangements, my favorite of which was the import permit program, where if you wanted to import machinery into Mexico, you had to get a permit, but you couldn't apply for the permit until you imported the machinery, which meant if you didn't know somebody in the government, you imported the machines and it sat in customs for whoever knows how long, right? The other part of this was the way the financial system worked. You needed permission from the Secretary of the Treasury and the President in order to get a bank charter. Okay, so what was the structure of the banking system? Well, there were a whole bunch of commercial banks, but in fact, 4 commercial banks controlled about 80% of assets. Those same commercial banks owned the non-bank banks, what were called the financieras. Okay, those financieras and banks, what did they do? Well, they mostly lent to the industrial conglomerates that owned the banks, right? So the biggest of these, the Legarreta Group, which is one of the biggest beer and all kinds of important manufacturers in Mexico, also owned the largest bank and the largest financiera. That basically meant that access to capital was a barrier to entry. Now, one of the ways that you might think you could have gotten around this was to have state-owned banks. So they had a huge state-owned banking system, which were these sort of government-run banks. This is the red line here. This is bank lending by type from 1940 to 1978. And you'll see the blue line's the financieras. These are sort of like investment banks. The yellow line is commercial banks. And you see these are very low percentages of GDP. The commercial banks are only about 5%. Lending from commercial banks is about 5%. Who did the government-owned banks lend to? They lent to the same conglomerates. In fact, in the 1960s, the government's industrial finance bank only lent to 47 companies. 4 of those companies comprised 30% of all the lending. So this was a very cartelized economy in which it wasn't just foreign trade was cut off, all competition was constrained. There were national labor agreements, for example, industry-wide labor agreements in which manufacturers all paid the same wages across the country. So the whole thing was set up to discourage competition. Now, if you look at, so in all of this, I want to be clear, this is an equilibrium, right? It's a way to win elections and create peace in a country that had had a very violent revolution in the 1910s. And it was very good at that is at creating peace, but very bad at creating economic growth and opportunity. It's not a surprise that I'll show a slide of this in a minute, that circa 1970, Mexico has amongst the most unequal distributions of income on the planet. There was only 2 countries more unequal, Brazil and South Africa. That was really an accomplishment. It was the South Africans invented apartheid, right? This was a country that had fought a social revolution to make everybody better off, and yet was highly unequal because of the cartelized nature of the economy. All right, if you look at NAFTA today, there's a very different equilibrium in Mexico. There's an open, export-driven economy. There is high levels of foreign direct investment relative to what they were before, and I'll show a slide on this. Sustained growth, although not at breakneck levels, which I think is important. Financially more open, increased levels of public goods provision, falling levels of poverty, which is something I'm going to come back to because one of the big winners of NAFTA, I actually think, are Mexican workers. Less corruption than there was certainly under this old cartelized arrangement, and most importantly, a multi-party democracy. These features are not independent of each other, just like the old sort of cartelized Mexican system, though all the features of it were not independent of each other. They're part of a sort of general political and economic equilibrium. I want to be careful about causation. I don't think the identification Taliban from the AER is in the room, but NAFTA was not, okay, that didn't get a laugh. My grad students think it's funny. NAFTA was not a randomized field experiment designed by Esther Duflo. Okay, it's part of a process that begins earlier in the 1980s, as Jaime Sarapucci pointed out, with Mexico's decision to join the GATT. But it's an important part of the shift in Mexico from one equilibrium to another, and it helped push that shift in equilibrium in ways that were not anticipated, I think, by Carlos Salinas at the time that he decides to go for free trade. One of the other points I want to make here is that economists are in the business of giving advice to politicians about how to make economies grow. Politicians are not in the business of taking their advice. They're in the business of winning elections. The reason why Carlos Salinas took good advice can be seen in one slide. So this is real GDP per capita in 2005, purchasing power parity, real dollars, from 1974 to 2012. The red bars are pre-NAFTA. The blue bars are post-NAFTA. You don't have to run a regression to see that there's two events here. The first is from 1981 to 1988, real per capita GDP in Mexico falls by close to 20%. That was a real wake-up call to the PRI. The second is, you can see, since NAFTA, the Mexican economy has started to grow again with some blips. But the whole point why Carlos Salinas took the advice from his economics team was because not just the economy is collapsing, real wages are collapsing. So this is an index of real manufacturing wages in Mexico. It's data from the International Labor Organization. You'll see the 1988 election, which Carlos Salinas wins, but we'll talk about in a minute, just barely. And real wages fall by about 50% from 81 to 88. How can you get such a fast fall in real wages? And one of the points I want to make here is that's the core part of the core coalition of the PRI. This was organized labor, right? They're seeing a dramatic drop in wages. How'd you get that? You got it through an inflation tax. So Mexican governments, beginning in the 70s, start running an inflation tax, and by the 1980s, inflation's over 100% a year. And so the labor leaders had agreed to hold down wage demands. There was an agreement between manufacturers, the government, and the big labor unions to hold down wage demands at the same time that inflation goes through the roof. All this means is that Carlos Salinas faces a big problem in 1988, which is it's not clear that the PRI, which had run Mexico since the 1930s, was going to survive. Up until the 1960s, the opposition parties were tiny, fragmented fringes. So this is the proportion of the valid vote won in Mexican presidential elections from 1960 to 2006. The red is the PRI, purple is the PAN, and the blue is the various left parties, which have changed over time. The point I simply want to make here is that circa 1988, which you can see marked here in this slide, Salinas wins with just over 50% of the vote, and that election was widely accused of being the product of fraud. He probably did really win the election, but by the skin of his teeth. The point was this, that on election night, the PRI panicked. And when the returns from Mexico City are coming in, and all these industrial workers who used to vote for the PRI are clearly abandoning the party because their wages have fallen, they shut down the computers that are counting the votes. They announced the computers broke. And then the next day or the day after, the PRI announces, well, we won. Now, the evidence seems to be that once they turned the computers on again, and a couple weeks later, they actually counted, Salinas won by a tiny margin, but this was, for the party, this was a disaster, right? They're in serious trouble. Okay. So Salinas takes the advice of his economic advisors, including Jaime Sarapucci, and opens up the trade and investment and privatization as a fix for an economy, and therefore as a fix for the PRI, because the fate of the party is in his hands. This is the red line here is the production-weighted average tariff in Mexico, and you can see a huge drop here in '88. And then the blue line is imports subject to permits. You'll notice in the early 1980s, it's 100%. This was part of how you run a cartel. And so those fall as well. Okay. One of the things that Jaime Sarapucci has mentioned is that NAFTA was not just about free trade. It's also about promoting foreign direct investment. That is really one of the keys to NAFTA. One of the problems that American and Canadian manufacturers had in Mexico was that there had been periodic, if you're running this cartel, right, periodically what you want to do is squeeze the foreigners. And so beginning with the Diaz-Ordaz administration in the 1960s, there's all these Mexicanization laws that pushed, for example, American firms operating in Mexico to export more than they imported, or at least an equal amount. So you had car manufacturers importing automobile parts into Mexico, but having to export oranges because they couldn't export those cars. So NAFTA gets rid of all those kinds of arrangements. And it gives foreign firms the ability to protect their property rights through NAFTA tribunals. That is, you can go outside of the Mexican legal system to protect your property rights. And it means that US and Canadian firms have to be treated just like Mexican firms. Okay, I'm going to need to move quickly here. So in some respects, NAFTA accomplished its design goals. This is exports as a percent of GDP in Mexico from 1960 to 2012. And you'll see the blue is, again, post-NAFTA. The red is pre-NAFTA. You don't have to have taken time series econometrics to see that there's a NAFTA effect. Mexico is now one of the most export-intensive economies in the world. About a third of GDP is exports. The other effect of this, and it's a huge transformation of Mexico. Mexico had primarily been a primary product exporter historically. So here you'll see the percentage of Mexican exports from 1960 to 2012. The sort of purple is manufactured goods. The green is fuel. Everything else is only about 10% today. Mexico is primarily an exporter of manufactured goods. Automobiles and automobile parts are the #1 export. But Mexico's also moved into helicopter production and the like. I think Sikorsky's opened a big plant. And fuel is now a trivial part of Mexican trade. There's been a tremendous movement of US and other multinational firms into Mexican manufacturing, particularly in the northern part of the country. One of the important effects of NAFTA, and this is contrary to sort of all the urban legend about NAFTA, is that most of the gains of NAFTA were captured by the Mexican middle class. This is the Gini coefficient pre-tax, pre-transfer from 1963 to 2010. These have been standardized by a fellow who's devoted his life to this doing this around the world, SALT. And what it basically shows is a falling Gini, that is an improvement in income equality in Mexico. I think this has an implication, for the United States, where we're very concerned today about increasing income inequality. Well, how did Mexico reduce income inequality? It wasn't by taxing the rich out of the country. It was by increasing competition within the country, creating more opportunities. So one of the big changes that's occurred in Mexico is the growth of a highly educated Mexican middle class that are engineers. They're working in finance. They're working for Sikorsky helicopter or Ford Motors. They're working for all the automobile parts manufacturers spread around Mexico. That's been one of NAFTA's huge success stories. So this was, I think if there's an implication for the US, it's about, if you want to think about income inequality, create competition, allow competition within the country. As I already mentioned, and as Jaime Sarapucci mentioned, foreign direct investment increases relative to what it was. So if you look, this is the problems between Microsoft and Apple are such that it dropped the years here. But this is foreign direct investment in millions of dollars from 1970, real dollars, from 1970 to 2012. Actually, these are current. And you'll see that circa 1970, the number is so close to zero, you can barely see it. Right? Again, there's this big post-NAFTA effect. But we have to keep in mind that it's still modest relative to the size of the Mexican economy. So this is FDI inflows as a percent of GDP. In no year does it exceed 5%. And the big spikes there just after 2000, that's basically the purchase of Mexico's banks by Citibank, HSBC, BBV, and Santander. So big increase in FDI, but relative to the size of the economy, less than was anticipated. And that has an interesting effect, which is that Mexico certainly grew after NAFTA, but not at a breakneck pace. On average, the trend rate of growth since NAFTA has been 1.1% a year in real per capita terms. That had an unanticipated effect. So think about the politics of this, and then I'll give Dan the floor. You have a coalition that has sort of cartelized the economy in the political system. A big part of that coalition are organized labor, public employees, manufacturers who are highly protected, and politicians. I like to liken this to had Richard Daley been allowed to run a country, what you would have had. Okay, no Chicagoans here.
Daley ran a damn good Chicago.
He did. And the PRI ran a damn good Mexico, right? It was good in the sense that they had peace. There was law and order. But it was not characterized by openness, okay? Opening up the economy to trade and investment caused this huge disruption. Salinas as a politician, was gambling that he could create a new coalition to support the PRI because the economy would take off. And it would create a new coalition to support the party. The economy it grew, but it didn't take off. He couldn't put together a new coalition. The old coalition, the manufacturers go to the PAN, basically. Many of the workers in the protected industries go to the PRD. So what happens is new or old parties like the PAN, which had been a pro-business party going back to the 1940s, grow exponentially in this period and force a set of changes in Mexico's electoral rules that are very hard fought. Both the PRD and the PAN fight very hard for changes in the rules. The long and the short of it is that the PAN wins the 2000 election. The Salinas, that is the PRI, loses its control of Congress in 1997, and it loses its control of the presidency in 2000. That results, so this is in the democratization of Mexico, this is the polity score. This is scoring by a set of political scientists who assign it's an index of political, of democracy. So a 0 here would be Saudi Arabia or China. 100 on this scale would be Sweden, the place all political scientists seem to want to live. Got to laugh. Mexico, above an 85 is generally taken as democracy. Okay, so Mexico, beginning in 2000, starts to score at the democratic level. Mexico today has a multi-party democracy in which elections are cleanly run and hard fought. So even though the PRI came back to power in 2012, the 2012 elections, it's a very different PRI than the PRI of the 1970s. This is a PRI what's the first thing it did? The first thing the new president did was he arrested the head of the teachers union, threw her in jail for corruption. That's a dramatically different PRI. So the final point I want to make here is that one of the effects of NAFTA, completely unanticipated at the time, was that when you begin to open up an economy, once you open things up, it sets in motion a process that may be very difficult to control. This is a clear case of it. The big winners of this were the Mexican public in ways that were unanticipated. And I'll end by saying I think it has implications for China. Right? No country has ever managed to, except for Singapore, which is really a city-state, not a country, has actually managed to successfully open up and create a competitive economy in which there's equality of opportunity, more equality of opportunity, and not democratized. That's a very rare occurrence. Right? And you see the countries that have done it, they all tend to democratize. Mexico is an example, and I think that there's a lesson here for the Chinese as they think about opening up, what it's going to mean for the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you.
Wow, that was super interesting.
Okay, your turn then.
Interesting.
Well, if I'd known that we were going to be talking about the political economy of trade agreements, I would have come with a very different talk. It's a hugely interesting topic that I've been working on for the last 5 years. But let me go back to where we stand, which is, it strikes me listening to the conversation around the table, that there's a marked contrast to where we are today. I think today we live in an era of very small-minded politics. I think we glorify dysfunctional partisanship that stymies any kind of policy initiative. And as a result, I think we live in an era that is even smaller-minded on policy. And listening to the discussion around the table, it's also very clear that it was not always this way. There was a time when our leaders led from the front. There was a time when they were prepared to take us down a very bold economic path. And those leaders are here now, with Carla and Jaime and Mickey. And this won't surprise you for who my favorite is in the group, given that I spell favorite with a U. And of course, Michael, who I've had the pleasure of interacting with now on a number of occasions over the past years. So you are, for me, you're larger than life, and to have had the opportunity to meet you is really quite a pleasure. And I was going to pay tribute by recounting the remarkable accomplishments and the benefits that have accrued to Canada, but then I ran into Mickey Cantor in the airport yesterday, and what he said to me was, well, if this is just going to be another discussion about all the good we did back, 20 years ago, well, I don't want to have any part of it. We got to talk about what comes next. And I was very impressed by that, so I then started to rethink about some of the things that I should be talking about. Was he always like that? What a ball of fire. So let me take you back to Canada as it was before the Free Trade Agreement, and that it was a country that was, like Mexico, sheltered behind a very high tariff wall. And industrial organization in that environment was such that the competitive environment was very weak. Business had figured correctly that if they didn't face any competition, then there's really no point in working to invest in innovative techniques to survive. So they had no interest and no incentive to invest in new technologies that would produce new processes that reduce costs and that would produce the new products that would allow you to charge the high markups that really allow firms to pay big dividends and to pay high salaries and wages. So CAFTA and then NAFTA pulled down that tariff wall, and in doing so, it really improved the competitive environment. And in what sense? To me, I think a good way of saying it, I'll put up a slide. As an economist, I can get very technical, and I think it's best sometimes to stay far away from that technicality. I think what it did is it really affected the pressure and support that Canadian businesses felt. In what sense did it do that? Well, the support, of course, is improved access to a bigger market, and not just any old bigger market, but I think, and this point applies very much in spades to Mexico, it's a market, the US market, which has these very demanding buyers who come to Canadian firms and say, you're not doing it well enough, we don't like what you're doing, but here's how you can do it better. And you have the same sophisticated suppliers, whether it be manufacturers of machinery and equipment, whether it be management consulting firms, whether it be new ways of doing finance that weren't available in the Canadian market. These sophisticated suppliers and demanding buyers, they are the ones that are supporting Canadian firms. But of course, at the same time, you're facing a great deal of pressure. And that pressure makes these firms with a decision that they have to make. Either we upgrade and face the competition, or we fold and die. And you see a lot of that shakeup happening in the Canadian economy. So in my view, and this is where sort of Mickey's comments really influenced what I wanted to talk about. In my view, we don't really think about trade agreements sufficiently in these terms. And if we don't think about them, we won't understand what Canada went through, and we won't understand how to take the real lessons of Canada, US Free Trade Agreement, and NAFTA into the next generation of agreements. So what are those? I think this slide sort of, for me, captures it. Because it seems to me that many of our agreements focus on the minutiae of special interest politics. And we get carried away, and this is an example of it. In the European Union, there's a tariff against plastic figurines. And that tariff is 0 if you're human, if it's a human figurine, and it's high if it's a non-human figurine. what do you do with Spock? Right? So these are the kinds of debates I feel that we face when we go into negotiations. And they're the wrong debates, of course, right? First of all, we're making a huge mistake because the EU decided that Spock was non-human, which I personally think is, his mom was in fact human, so I thought that was a bad decision right there. But I think it's worse. I think it's worse because it's really, who cares? Who cares about this kind of minutia? Why are we being driven by special interests? Where is the big vision about what these agreements are trying to reach? And I would say that, Stephen, in your talk, you're really hitting on what I would say is the biggest issue, which is what does it do to the fabric of society, in particular political and constitutional issues. But you've totally preempted me on that, and wonderfully so. And I think we can make some similar comments in the Canadian context as well. So my starting point here is quite different. It's purely economic. And that is that even within very narrowly defined industries, there are huge differences in the ability of, in the performance of firms. There are huge productivity differences. When I use the word productivity, I use it in a very loose sense. I mean, ability of firms to cut costs, and to introduce process innovations that are going to find new ways of delivering goods with fewer inputs. But I also mean it in terms of profitability. I mean the ability of firms to find new markets, identify new products that are going to allow them to charge the markups that are really important for both profitability and for worker success. And you don't have to look far. I mean, currently Apple versus BlackBerry is a good example of creating value. Unfortunately, Canada currently is coming out in the short end of that stick, but there'll be other products that we will come out as the winners, and I'm quite confident that we're capable of that. So now what I'd like to do is take you through something very, very difficult, but it's worth doing, because at some point we have to be fact-based. At some point we have to do analysis which is not just rhetoric, but really reflects the huge amount of research that people like Lorenzo and I and others have been doing to try and understand what do these agreements do to the underlying economy. So I know this is a real eye chart, but let me take you through it a little bit slowly. On the horizontal axis is the productivity of firms. And what we have represented here is the distribution of productivities in Canadian manufacturing. So we're looking at data for 35,000 Canadian manufacturing firms. And this is what fact-based means today. It means looking at not anecdotes, but thousands and thousands and thousands of performance outcomes. And what you have is the height. This is like a bell curve. The height of that curve, of these two curves, tells you how many firms are in each location in the spectrum of productivity, from over on the left low productivity to over on the right high productivity. And it looks like a bell curve. That's not surprising. What's worthwhile doing is to break it up between the exporters and non-exporters. And what you see is that non-exporters are heavily represented on the left side. That's to say that there are that non-exporters tend to be lower productivity firms. And you see on the right side, the red line, is you see the exporters, and they tend to be on the right. They tend to be heavily represented on the high productivity spectrum. So immediately we get an implication about the effects of trade agreements that is simply not properly discussed in the day-to-day discourse of agreements. Right? And that is that by giving Canadian firms the opportunity to expand into the US market, because the US generously agreed to lower their tariffs against Canadian firms, it allowed exporters to grow. It supported Canadian firms. It allowed our most productive firms to export. And when Canadians graciously allowed the American firms to compete in Canada by lowering the Canadian tariffs, it pressured Canadian firms. It made them face stiffer competition, and those non-exporters suffered. They suffered big time. They were simply not able to compete. So what's the net effect of that for productivity? It's an effect that we don't talk about often enough. And the best way to talk about it is to remember the sigh of relief you had in grade 10 math, when at the end of the year, the teacher announced that, boy, the average grade in this course is pretty low, so I'm going to do you guys all a favor, and I'm going to let you drop your lowest grade. And everybody said, oh, everybody immediately understood, even in grade 10 math, that raised the average grade. Right? And when you get to drop your lowest productivity firms and you get to put more weight on your highest productivity firms, this is good news for the economy. There's winners, there's losers, but overall, this is good news for average productivity. So that's the first big effect of this agreement. I don't think we really understood that. I'm going to guess that Michael and Jaime and Carla, these weren't on your radar screen because we didn't know about it. We didn't have the technology to discuss this back then. There's a second effect, and the second effect is what do firms actually do in response? Not only do they grow, but they actually actively work to improve their productivity. Okay? And what do they specifically do? Well, we know that there's this wonderful synergy, this complementary reinforcement between exporting and investing in productivity. Trouble with investing in productivity is to find new products or to find new ways of producing things cheaper. The problem with that is that it's expensive upfront investments that are required. So where do you find the money for that? Well, it turns out that if you export, you generate revenues for your firm. Those revenues support the innovation. And if you innovate, you increase your market share abroad. So we have this positive feedback. You invest, it makes you more profitable abroad. When you're profitable abroad, you have the funds to do the investments. And that synergy, we can see it in a very fine-grained analysis of firms. You see it, for instance, in the huge improvements in adoption rates of lean manufacturing in Canada. Not across the board, but differentially for those firms that saw the tariffs fall on their goods. In other words, for those firms that were best positioned to benefit from the agreement because they were facing stiff U.S. tariffs, those are the firms that start doing business differently. And when they do business differently, they survive and they improve their productivity. So if we actually try to put some numbers on it, because the numbers are, to my mind, are really remarkable. I just want to keep it to a few small numbers. The first row there, the growth of exporters. What it's saying is that as we let exporters grow, we raise our average productivity. By how much? In Canada's context, we raised manufacturing productivity by about 4%. And when we hammered those less productive firms and forced them to exit or to contract, we got another more than 4 percentage points on our manufacturing productivity. In addition, the fact that firms were now had a bigger incentive to invest than ever before in productivity, that further raised productivity by another 5%. And you put all those together, and you start getting some pretty big numbers. We reduced tariffs, and we increased productivity by 13, 14%. It's hard sometimes for non-economists to understand what those numbers mean. I like to think of it as basically we have given to every man, woman, and child in Canada another 50. We've given to the Canadian economy, we've given about $50 billion of value each year. We get that every year. It's like a check that comes from, it's like your baby bonus check. You just, do the right thing and you get $50 billion every year. And the government gets $20 billion every year, which, Michael, you're a finance minister. That must be some pretty reassuring number to you. Put that in Canadian context, in U.S. context, just scale up by 10. It's $200 billion in government coffers every year. That's a lot of fiscal room. Okay, so let me then move on. I wasn't sure if I should talk about this, but I thought that it's worthwhile saying at least a little bit about it. Because I want to take this a little bit from, actually, John, how are we doing for time?
Well, we're supposed to end the session at 11:45, which means we have time for discussion, so. And you want to have a general discussion,
yeah.
so I'd say.
Maybe then I can postpone, or not even talk about, how do you translate this into future agreements? Why don't we just leave that and open up for discussion? I think the bottom line here is that this free trade agreement had very tangible, very concrete, rigorously identified, I'm part of the Taliban, the AR Taliban, huge effects. I guess to summarize it is, the reason that we've had those effects is because people like Michael and Carla and Jaime and Mickey went out there, did the right thing, and showed leadership, got ahead of the pack, got ahead of public opinion, and did the right thing. And so I personally am hugely grateful that you did that. So thank you.
Just a quick intervention. Dan, you'll have plenty of time when we talk about the future. There are sessions at the end where we'll be talking about TPP and what the lessons are, and you'll have plenty of time to go into it then.
So you want to have a general discussion now, correct? Of-
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyone who wants to speak about the first set of remarks or about what you've just heard, the floor is open.
One of the things that impressed me as Carla talked and others was the immense amount of time you spent consulting with members of Congress and talking to them. And I think it's just true, it's absolute truth, that if you want me with you on the landing, include me in the takeoff. If you negotiate something and throw it out to Congress, you're not going to get that. So I think that's one of the reasons why we succeeded.
I'd add to that, George, the importance of getting congressional support is more important in the United States than it is in a parliamentary democracy where the governing party controls the outcome. So we never had the concern about getting support from Parliament. The party was basically supportive of the leadership. But the SAGIT, the ITAC and SAGIT, these were consultative bodies that we had, similar to what Carla has described. That really got us into every little bit of the economy and brought on side, because people understood what the agreement was going to be about and what the impacts were going to be on them. It got them on side so that they were supporters out there in the community and provided a balance there from the economic side to all of these really wayly exaggerated rhetorical things about what's going to happen to our social programs or our culture, our national sovereignty, and so on. I think that was an extraordinarily important part of it for us to get the final result on side.
I think it helps you as a negotiator.
Yes.
If it's clear to your opposite number that what you agree to is going to be
Yeah.
upheld.
Yeah. And
They're uncertain about you. So we seem to have fallen out of the habit of this kind of consultation. But it has to be done across the board by partisan.
yeah.
And Congress, which has to run for election, needs to have the support of the people to win. And so they have to be knowledgeable. And trade agreements are often complicated. So you can hear in your district, well, we're going to have a loss of jobs. You've got to give them the information to counter. And when you have voices that have prestige, that speak against trade, you find the polls sinking down. We saw that after the 2008 presidential election, where two respected senators really outcompeted each other for no more trade agreements, time out for trade, no more NAFTAs, renegotiate the NAFTA. And the Pew poll showed that the American people became frightened of trade. Lately, while we're trying to double exports, we've got to get out in the globalized economy. It's interesting, although the public seems less anxious to get out on the security side of issues, they're more willing to understand that we have to be a player in the global market. And so the antagonism to trade has reduced somewhat. But I think that you really have to sell the agreement, and so you need the spokesmen, the spokespeople who are elected to get out there and participate.
I'd make a couple of comments on U.S. politics from having been involved in a little bit and observing it. It's important to know it's not just that we have our particular checks and balances and we're not a parliamentary democracy, we're a republic. Congress has all these powers. But typically the rules of the Senate have allowed very, very, very narrow special interests to block a lot. So Carla had to deal with the Carolina senators over textiles. I had to deal with them over when President Bush agreed we would double the number of Polish wool women's skirts from 25,000 to 50,000 we allowed in, the quota to double. This trivial thing, because the Berlin Wall fell, we had a presidential mission to Poland I was on, Lech Walesa was coming, they wanted to announce it. Even that was difficult. So it's important to understand how important fast track is, because it's not just that as a group they'll start doing it, but some very, very narrow interests, historically heavily, agriculture and textiles were really important in that. So I think that's one thing. And I'll leave with this famous quote from Senator Thurman, how can we produce the parachutes for the next invasion? So he was very concerned about losing our mills in the Carolinas, as perhaps he should have been as representing those people. So you get it's not just a motive, but they have the rules of our system designed on balance, I think, correctly to sort of temper the passions of the age, if you go back to looking at what Madison and others wrote, gave very narrow special interests that were geographically extremely concentrated, a lot of blocking power. Yeah.
Russell Long's mantra was better than John Thurman's. Russell said, "I'm against any deal I'm not in on."
That was Russell. Yeah.
Just one other thing we talked about, competitiveness and innovation. I guess this ties into innovation, but sometimes not necessarily. Quality is an important element of the competitive environment, and I use our wine sector as the important one, as an important one for us. Our wine growers were absolutely terrified that the grain growers from the Napa Valley and other places in the United States were just going to kill them. And the politicians, we fell for it and gave them $10 million to pull all their vines out of the ground. But at the same time, the governments realized that they had to free up the regulatory process on wines, Canadian-grown wines, and to allow them to compete. And about 3 or 4 years, I guess late 90s, I was coming home on the plane from Europe, and there was a wine grower, a wine company guy, and I said, "How are things going?" expecting him to punch me in the face. And he said, "Well, come on over here." He took me over to his seat and opened up his briefcase, and there were 3 certificates that he had won in France for the quality of the wines that he was producing in the Niagara region. And he was very proud of that. But what we did was open it up so that they could bring different wine varieties in, grape varieties in, and grow better grapes and make better wine.
That's Daniel's point, in a different way.
Yeah.
Let me ask the 3 negotiators. What do you think didn't work as you anticipated? What do you wish had been included that wasn't? We made some references to energy and so on, not to preempt the later panel. And what do you wish could have been excluded if that was possible? I mean, looking back on it, there's an issue of whether it could get political passage. Obviously, I was not a big fan of the labor and environment addenda, but what would you like to have done somewhat differently if the politics had allowed, or what has surprised you about its implementation?
I think the agreement worked pretty well. I would have liked to have seen immigration as part of the agreement. We call that Mode 4, and had workers be able to come across borders, eliminate a lot of friction that we had today. And I would like to have seen energy put on the table. But both were politically impossible for Mexico and for the United States, respectively. So but as far as what would we have done differently, I don't want to say anything that I would have said different, other than maybe expedite the agreement. It would have, if we could have signed the agreement in April, then we could have enforced it that much earlier. And that would have been something that President Bush would have greatly appreciated.
Yeah.
I'm going to say what I think should be different, and then why we didn't do it. I think the energy chapter should have been different, but there is no way we could have done something different. And now, by the way, I think it's time to do it. As we speak now, the Mexican Congress is discussing a new transformation in the energy sector, which, if it works, is going to be huge. And by the way, that presents a very important opportunity for the NAFTA countries to think intelligently on how to include an energy agreement for North America. But back then, 20 years ago, the first sentence of the chapter number 6 in NAFTA, the first sentence says, the three parties agreed to be fully respectful of their constitutions. And I pushed for that sentence because that was the only way I could go to the Senate in Mexico and say, I'm not selling the oil. I was being accused of selling the country, selling everything. So I had to go to the Mexican Senate saying, I'm not selling the oil. Here it is. They are going to respect our constitution. But that was a political constraint that back then made sense. I don't think it makes sense now. My recommendation would not be changing Chapter 6 of NAFTA, but finding some way of contribution and collaboration among the three countries that is sort of parallel or side to the NAFTA text. The second thing that I didn't like is we did not have enough. I thought we were being a bit too modern in the institutions we created with NAFTA, Carla and Michael. Sort of very horizontal, and we have had problems. For instance, Mexico has not been able yet to convince the U.S. government to let the trucks cross the border. It's not a minutia, by the way, Dan, on that. That one is very relevant. The logistics are incredibly complicated nowadays. And the agreement was to open the states on the border, neighbors to the border first, and keep on opening the rest of the territories. Well, the AFL-CIO and Hoffa, before he disappeared, I don't know who did this, but they stopped it with a judge, and we haven't been able to solve that. So the instrument for dispute settlement it should get a bit more teeth. And the third is labor mobility. I fully agree with Carla, but there was no way that would have been accepted by the U.S. Congress, I don't think. Actually, we used to say we want to export merchandise and not people. Mm-hmm. And that's why we were justifying with that expression the reason why we didn't have a labor mobility or a migration issue in NAFTA. Now I think it's time to think about that as well. So in my view, and I will talk about that later with more detail, the next two relevant issues for NAFTA is energy and labor mobility, and some issues on architecture.
Michael?
I'd just give three and a fourth as a throwaway. One is border management, and we saw this after 9/11. That really complicated the relationship, not just in those early days after 9/11 when the border just seized up, but with the impact of 9/11, it led to a number of actions taken by the United States to hurt the normal flow of traffic. It's different than your trucking problem. That's a separate thing, but this one is more security related, but it really was something that, certainly when I was in Washington, it was a huge preoccupation. One of the things I tried to get into both FTA and in NAFTA was dairy and poultry, and I couldn't get them to move that far. It was just an absolute. They knew that if they let a little crack in the door open, that they risked a significant change. Now that's going to come, whether it's with the European deal or whether the TPP. I think that we'll see that change. The third area is more our response. I was saying at the time that once we saw a greater degree of confidence with Canadian exporters being able to deal in the U.S. market, that they would naturally, I'm sorry, that they would naturally extend their wings and be more active in markets in other parts of the world. That is far slower than I thought. Our exports to the United States still, I think, are just short of 75%. They reached 89% at a peak after the FTA. But I'm not saying this as we want to diminish our relationship with the United States or with Mexico, but to expand. And I think it's been too slow both ways between Canada and Mexico. And as John Crosby said, there's too much bush and hills between Mexico and Canada. And there still is too much bush and hills.
One thing on that front, Mike, is that the statistics, and this is for the academic people, the statistics of trade between Canada and Mexico are complicated because many of our exports to Canada go through the U.S. And they classify it as a Mexico-U.S. export. And the same for the Canadians. So we need to work something out there.
That's the very good part of the deal, was just being the North American supply chain. The one thing that I wish had not happened in the NAFTA negotiations was when we were in the fifth inning of a baseball game in Baltimore. Jaime wanted to get back to the negotiation. The rest of us wanted to enjoy the ball game. As we were walking out, there was a huge roar. And it was a triple play. And that's the only triple play I would have ever seen in my life.
We went to the ball game.
I'm so sorry.
Because Michael left the negotiating table.
This is great.
I said to my staff, the heat's getting too much. We need the night off. Where can I take them? It's Kennedy Center. Get me 3 tickets. Maybe the presidential box is open. Came back. Kennedy Center is dark. I said, where do you take 2 guys? The ball game. I said, okay, I'll do anything for my country. So we go up to Baltimore to see this game. Jaime was in the car with me.
You have to tell them about the sweater.
You could tell that story. Jaime's in the car. Great soccer player. He might have been a soccer champ instead of an economist, but he wasn't enthusiastic about the game. This guy was, but he's the one who slammed out of the meeting. We could see him around the hotel walking, looking very grim. So we get to the game. At about the second inning, Jaime said, is it time to go home yet? I said, we haven't had our dinner yet. Third inning. We've had dinner. Is it time? Dessert's coming. Fourth, finally at that magic moment, I said, Michael, do you think we could go back? He said reluctantly, all right. And we're just getting out. And of course, there was the triple play. And
I'm sorry about that.
I've never heard the end of that one.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about that.
Playing is something spectacular.
I know.
I learned a lot about baseball.
I know.
One thing that questions about how wide open the agreement should be. You mentioned immigration, for example. I sometimes wonder and worry that if it gets too big, you're going to, in fact, the labor environment stuff probably held back some of the agreements recently. So that's really a question. My observation is when you do these negotiations, you have to have your export interests, which are sometimes going to be in one direction, and your import competing interests, and they have to work out the politics of those things, and which is going to be the more forceful in terms of putting together the package, or even within a particular narrow area.
I didn't understand.
Well, you have, exporters, they'd like to have tariffs reduced abroad.
Right.
And they're going to be the ones that work against your import competing firms that don't want the tariffs reduced. So you basically have those. So that's why you have, that's what bilateral and multilateral negotiations are all about. Otherwise, you just reduce your barriers yourself, unilateral. In fact, I remember being in some of these tariff negotiations myself. As an economist, it's very strange because you'd say, hey, we'd all be better off if we just all reduced our tariffs. Everybody, you, all around the table, all the different countries. But of course, that's not the politics. We will reduce our tariff if you reduce your tariff in this area. So that's why the multilateral, bilateral works. That has to be chosen pretty carefully if you're going to get the right political balance. It's in addition to making these cases to the broad public, you basically have to count who's going to be the most effective lobbyist. But it seems to me if you open this up very broadly, you're going to lose that balance. And that's really more of a question. I mean, immigration is such a big, complicated issue. To bring that into trade agreement, I'm sort of the view that a narrower type of, yes, you want intellectual property, yes, you want to deal with non-tariff trade barriers. But when it gets too big, it gets into other areas which are not related to trade at all.
I'll react to that. I think so. I tend to agree with you. When I say that for the future of NAFTA, I think the labor mobility or the immigration issues is irrelevant, I don't mean to change NAFTA. I mean to improve the North American region the economics of the North American region. On the tariff issue, you know, we pretty much had it clear, that one, because we knew that we were going to get to zero tariff regardless. So as I was saying, the transition helped us a lot. So we had a system of negotiators from the private sector that we call the next room group. So we invited many of our entrepreneurs in Mexican to come to the negotiations, and we had them in a special room next to us. And we kept on consulting with them. The consultation was not if your tariff is going to go to zero. The consultation is how quickly. So and that really made it possible, because the concept at the end was to have free trade. Very different, I'm sorry that Mickey had to leave, but I started saying that, very different from the negotiation on the side agreements, because the side agreements were something, you know, that was said in a speech in North Carolina. So by the time we understood exactly how to handle that, and therefore including these issues into the trade agreement, we had to spend a lot of time. And what we tried to do with the Mexican was to separate as much as possible the environmental and labor issues from the trade agreement. And that was the battle. That's why it took us a year.
I agree with you on you can make an agreement too big, but and I don't think that at the NAFTA we could have had labor mobility. But think of today, where services makes up so much of our productivity as an economy. And one way to prevent the initiation of services, whether it be banking or insurance, is you can't get your people in, and you can't get your experts in. And so a country, a government, could agree to a services opening, but preclude you indirectly. And I think that's something we're going to have to think about in the future. Also, we would be benefited. I mean, had we been wise and able politically to have had labor mobility, it would have actually benefited the U.S. economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a matter of what you can do, whether you may have lost NAFTA completely if you had included that.
I would like to react to the discussion, also to the excellent presentation by Dan about this new channel in which trade agreements actually can make benefits to all of us, which is the gain in productivity. Now, one way in which firms actually improve their productivity is by the way they organize their production. Namely, the way actually, and this actually defined in different studies, the way actually they manage their organization, the type of employees that they are able to hire. Now, non-exporters also gain in terms of productivity because they're forced to actually reorganize their production. They receive import competition, and because of that, they have to change the type of employees that they have. So any type of restriction in the labor market is going to stop those potential actually gains in productivity that actually Dan was talking. That one.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we have right now is, in terms of broadening, is on the regulatory or the standard setting side. I'm going to talk about that later on today, but that when we look at some of the issues that we have in accessing a marketplace, those are far more important now than any tariff differences.
Let me make a couple of quick comments and then have us break for lunch, and anything else can be held for the afternoon session. First of all, I think it's important to note, it's become increasingly true where global supply chains have become more important, that the constituency for tariff reduction in a country includes importers of intermediate products. So Don Fisher and the Gap were in your office all the time saying they want to be able to import textiles. more liberal quotas, reduced tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that's important to understand. And it gets to the point Jaime was making earlier about the data and where stuff's going, but it's also what the value added component is in different places. I think George is probably going to make a comment about that at lunch. But the WTO and OECD have this project that's in the very early days. It's far from perfect, trying to get value added trade accounts. It's not an easy thing to do, but in some sense, that's kind of the information we really need. I'm going to add one other comment that we could easily go on and take the descriptions of Mexico that Steve portrayed prior to NAFTA, and Dan to a not as dramatic extent in Canada, the lack of competition and openness and so on, could be extended to a lot of other places. You mentioned China, but with Mary here, I thought I'd mention that there are some other places in our hemisphere whose profile today looks not dissimilar to how you describe Mexico. Roaring inflation, all these restrictions, government nationalization of business. I think at one time Pedro Aspe told me the Mexican government owned 19 cantinas. There, the politics in those places, Argentina, Venezuela, et cetera, are not quite the same, ready for opening up as perhaps Mexico was when President Salinas came to office. But it gives you a way to think about some ways those places could actually do better and maybe get to a better equilibrium along the way you describe it. Maybe we're going to talk about TTIP and TPP later on toward the end of the day, but maybe we can return to that if anybody has any thoughts on it. But let's break for lunch, and I need a restroom break. I'm sure many others do. Thank you. I think it's been really informative, and after we have a bit to eat, we'll hear from George on the new North America.